Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, I want to praise Lisa for her brilliance and a resolute spirit to put this important event together. I think she deserves a full round of applause. Secondly, part of her hard job was being able to bring our special guests from abroad. And to our guests from abroad, I want to say welcome to Israel Shalom. Thank you for coming. I come to you not from a geopolitical or national security background, but in fact I attend the conferences and the workshops and the lectures by Jonathan and learn a lot from him. I come to you from a background of Hasbara, which is Israeli advocacy and public diplomacy, non-government public diplomacy. And because it's non-government, I can begin talking in a non-diplomatic, undiplomatic manner. Because Europe applies double standards when it comes to a lot of things connected with Israel. But in my opinion, now we can clearly see Europe as the standard bearer of double standards, particularly when it comes to refugees and migrants. Europe touts itself as the beacon of tolerance, human rights and compassion. They've concentrated much of their moral superiority in looking down on Israel, passing resolutions against us and demanding that we apply to their standards. So let's look for a moment at some of those standards as it applies to the migrants. And let's see how their supreme values of multiculturalism and liberal policies are working out for them. The Czech Prime Minister, Miloš Zeman, recently said, "It's practically impossible to integrate Muslims into Europe. The Czech Republic refuses to open its borders to the massive refugees." Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán complained that the flood of migrants, in his words, could redraw Europe's cultural and religious identity. Hungary and Slovenia have erected barbed wire fences along their borders. Hungary imprisons all undocumented migrants for up to 3 years. Poland and Slovakia refuse any refugee from entering their countries. Austria allows only 80 refugees a day to apply for asylum, and they're reviewing this figure downward. So you say these are not really liberal democracies. The Danish government is confiscating valuables from migrants to cover the cost of their processing. They're taking their laptops, their watches, and the cash amounts that they have over $1,415. And this theft is being enshrined in Danish law. Switzerland is now doing the same thing, and Germany is to follow suit. Can we imagine the global protest that would happen if Israel would contemplate taking steps like this against anybody? Doctors Without Borders are refusing to treat the migrants in Italy because the Italian government is allowing the migrant reception centres, which accommodate tens of thousands of migrants, to fall into disrepair. Squalid toilets, bug-infested facilities, showers without privacy, untreated mould, water leak, damp. And the Italian government are doing this on purpose to make places like these unattractive and uninviting to migrants. Tensions between EU countries over migrants are at breaking point, as thousands of migrants are living in terrible conditions. Even the unwelcome European winter is something these migrants have never experienced before. But I would put it that the climate in Europe is turning decidedly chilly as nations struggle to cope with the never-ending tsunami of migrants. EU states are tightening their borders. The Schengen zone of free passage is under threat, which means the whole concept of an open Europe is under threat. there is violence and intimidation wrought by migrants throughout Europe. But statistics shows that this intimidation and violence are often from the migrants from the North African bloc, or places like Pakistan, rather than Syria and Iraq. Calais is overwhelmed with migrants trying to get into the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom don't want to take them. Obviously, the migrants want to try and take advantage of the British welfare state. These are basically economic migrants, and not refugees fleeing for danger, death, and persecution. But the Calais residents, the citizens there, live in fear as an unruly behavior of the mob that occupies their land. The refugee camp in Calais is called the Jungle. Now, let's go to Sweden. Sweden is deporting half of last year's asylum seekers. That's 80,000 people. And Finland is to expel 20,000 people who arrived in 2015. After Norway deported 824 Muslim migrants for their violent crimes, the crime statistics in Norway dropped by 30%. Now, we all know what happened in German cities on New Year's Eve. This is migrant chaos in Europe. Calais is no longer Calais. Cologne is no longer Cologne. Malmö is no longer Malmö. And compassionate Europe is no longer compassionate Europe. The expression we hear is that most migrants don't leave the Middle East for Europe, they bring the Middle East to Europe. For too many, what they don't receive, they take, often with violence, food, equipment, clothing, even sexual gratification. Criminal elements are North African mainly and Pakistani migrants. In Europe we have seen, even with the earlier migrants, a disconnect, a lack of ability to integrate, a lack of desire to celebrate the customs and norms of the host countries, and a growing radicalization among the second generation immigrants is adding to the concern. All this and more are causing deep rifts within most European societies, leading to a backlash from the indigenous population. So Europe can no longer look down their noses at Israel. On the contrary, they should look to Israel for examples of how to solve migrant and refugee crises problems. Turkey is demanding 3 billion euros annually from the Europeans to stop the migrant influx into Europe. So what is the solution to the problem of migrants? Let's differentiate between the economic migrants exploiting the situation to gain a free path into Europe and the genuine refugees fleeing danger and persecution. Clearly, if ISIS was destroyed and the world could put an end to the Syrian conflict, that would be great. The international community must make a concerted effort to build and relocate the refugees, but we all know this will take years, perhaps even decades. Jordan and Turkey are unable or unwilling to take more refugees. It's a disgrace that the wealthy oil states have done little to nothing to assist their co-religionists and fellow Arabs. The overwhelming majority of displaced Syrians are Sunni Muslims, yet Saudi Arabia does nothing. There may be a reason why Saudi Arabia is reluctant to take in more Syrian refugees or Sunni Arabs from Syria. They and the United Arab Emirates have been bombing ISIS, which is hostile to the Saudi regime. Some Arabs have joined ISIS or al-Nusra, and the refugees are either fleeing from ISIS or from the Saudis, his bombing, or Hezbollah, or Assad, or even the Russian bombing these days. Egypt and Jordan are scared that the refugees have links to the Muslim Brotherhood, or ISIS, as we heard from Jonathan. So I repeat again, what are the solutions to this intractable migrant problem? I suggest that out of darkness and lack of hope, we should think out of the box and employ original and creative thinking. So allow me to give you a partial solution that may surprise you. As a step in solving the refugee crisis, I propose the world should look carefully at the Israel model. First, let me make a comparative study. Tiny Israel, in its short history, has welcomed and absorbed over 4 million refugees and immigrants. Almost 2 million from Europe, including Russia, from the United States and Canada, and from Oceania, consisting of over 35% of the population in Israel today. Almost 1 million came from Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Ethiopia, consisting 16% of the population. Almost 700,000 came from Asia, Turkey, Iran, Yemen, India, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, constituting about 13% of the population. Jewish migrants have come out of the ashes of the Holocaust, fled the anti-Semitism of Europe, escaped the Soviet Union, been airlifted out of war-torn Ethiopia and Yemen, evicted from Arab and Muslim lands. Add to that the migrant Arabs, Bedouin, Arameans, Druze, Assyrians, Circassians, Armenians, and the Baha'is, attracted by the Zionist enterprise and Israel and the work, the security, and the freedoms and the refuge that Israel offers. Contrary to the current migrant crisis, the mass of humanity made their way into the Middle East and not out of it. Today, there are no refugees in Israel. Let's compare that to the manner in which Arab regimes have kept million fellow Arabs who profess to be Palestinians for 70 years, into their 4th and 5th generation. They have been kept in refugee camps, stateless, bereft of higher education, barred from holding high office, and that figure of 1 million has become bloated with every generation. And this sad state of Arab apartheid is maintained by one of the United Nations Refugees Organization, UNRWA, proving the ineffectiveness of the United Nations when refugees are linked to a political agenda. Now look at Israel. Our refugees have reached the highest position in the land. And how was that achieved? And how can this be applied to in Iraq and Syria? This is where a compassionate humanitarian solution begins. Utilize and respect the core identity of the refugees. Take their ethnic, cultural, and religious origins into account and base it on the land that they love. Just as the foundation of the Jewish state was premised on rehabilitating our people through collective desire of a dispersed people to weld themselves to the land and to their ethnic religious origins, so the same approach must be adopted when dealing with rehabilitating the Yazidis and others in their homeland. We must take into account their connection to the land and to their unifying values and to their language and ethnicity and their historic and geographical roots. Lives must be constructed in safe zones close to their original homes under international protection. Let me go back to the start of what happened here. The first Zionists came in 1882 to create a new land that wasn't yet Israel. What did our early pioneers do, even before the establishment of the state? They built a network of kibbutzim that became the founding society that contributed to Israel's birth its development and its security. They tilled the land by day and they guarded their settlements by night. They turned a barren land into fertile valleys, malarial swamps into fish ponds. They worked in unity, collectively, respecting each other and themselves by the sweat of their brow. They celebrated and enjoyed the fruits of their labor. Their self-worth was empowered by leading healthy and productive lives which contributed to their community and nation, irrespective of the dangers around them. They gained expertise in agricultural development, water irrigation, crop production, land reclamation, and other skills. They became the leaders of a new country. They produced healthy crops where nothing had grown before. They irrigated land that hadn't seen water for centuries. They constructed dairies with cows that produced more milk than cows anywhere else on earth. They dug fish farms and grew fish miles from the sea. They worked hard, they felt productive and valuable. They had self-pride and ambition. They felt worthy, they felt tied to a cause. If you want a concept of rehabilitating people and rebuilding shattered lives, use the Israeli model, but we need to change the mindset of the Middle East for it to succeed. Now let me put some practical flesh on the bones of this concept. The refugees here in Iraq, in Syria, need not only protection, they need decent housing and productive work. These are the inducements to migrants to return to their homes, to the Middle East. This concept should be welcomed by overwhelmed European nations, just as Arab migrants were attracted to the early Zionist enterprise, so migrants and refugees will be attracted to the promise of homes and productive life if the Israeli model can be replicated for the Yazidis, the Kurds, the Iraqis and the Syrians. The problem as I see it is itemized by Jonathan, quite frankly, is that the Arabs of the Middle East traditionally only see things through their narrow self-interests. Even when a disaster falls on them, they are unable to think out of the box. Saudi Arabia, for instance, exploits its oil, uses the money for an opulent lifestyle and to export Wahhabism and the doctrine of their Sunni faith that has been the root cause of the sectarian violence that has devastated the region and too many lives. But nothing has been done by them for the homeless and the hungry that is a result of what they have exported. They should look closely at the values and examples of Jewish Israeli tikkun olam. Israel's selfless example includes flying halfway around the globe and being the first nation to set up field hospitals in earthquake-stricken Haiti and Nepal. Our search and rescue teams and disaster response units flew to Turkey and elsewhere, countries, we are told, that despise us. The first people that many refugees see, if they survive the watery crossing from Turkey to Greece, are the volunteers of Israel Aid wading in the waters of Lesbos to extend a rescuing hand to those whose upbringing have wrongly taught them that these Israeli Jews are their enemy. We give ourselves even to others in need who have negative views of us. This is a lesson that the whole of the Middle East must learn. Too many Arab state leaders cannot rise above their narrow ethnic or sectarian affiliations or individual interests to think of a multicultural, multi-ethnic world as a whole. Muslim nations must look beyond their own sectarian self-interests. This narrow perspective is driving the disaster. They must look to the Israeli example of tikkun olam, and they can begin to do that by providing better accommodation for the refugees who are in situ in the Middle East. They can do it by funding the reclamation of the land and projects like that will rehabilitate the broken souls of hopeless, desperate people, even if these people do not share their religious or ethnic origins. If we're doing that, so should they. Saudi Arabia has 300,000 air-conditioned structures lying empty in Mecca, waiting for the annual Hajj. They and Turkey should supply thousands of structures to replace the tents in the refugee camps. Let's be honest, they have a vested interest in spreading what is left of the Sunni influence in areas where Iranian Shiites are strengthening their grip. Turkey has a vested interest in not being further flooded by more refugees when the project succeeds. The migrants in Turkey will be attracted to leave and to return and join this enterprise. The Zionist imperative was to conquer a wasteland, not by war, but by hard labor. The ambition of Zionism created a new type of Jew, one whose head is held high, one of self-confidence that anything is possible if you put your back and your brain into it. Opponents of Zionism used the argument that Zionism was unrealistic because a wasteland couldn't possibly absorb millions of Jews. Zionists replied that with technical and engineering skills and hard work, they could turn this wasteland into a flourishing garden, productive enough to absorb all the Jews who wished to come. And their argument has been confirmed in history. The miracle of the Israel model can be applied to the Middle East refugees today. Refugees who feel that their lives are ruined and useless can be made to feel productive again. They can be taught new skills, or they can contribute their skills. They can lend their labor to a common cause, to make a land drenched in blood become a fertile land of hope and salvation. The fruit of their labor can be shared communally, and, as with the Israel model, the excess produce can be sold on markets, bringing in capital to expand the venture. Now, to those who say this is an overly optimistic vision that won't work, I say, especially to the European and Middle East experts, show me your current ideas for solving the problem, because quite frankly, I don't see any. It will require a massive international effort and investment. If governments don't want to see open Israeli participation because they're embarrassed of their overt connection with the Jewish state, we can still play a major role covertly, as we are doing today with many governments who officially don't recognize us but seek our expertise and help. That's okay, one day, they'll own up and acknowledge the contribution that Israel made in solving their most intractable problems. While the volume is loud with slanders and lies against Israel, the world knows little about how we are improving and saving lives daily in Africa and in Asia. We can do the same in the Middle East, but the world needs to welcome our assistance. When the world is in need, Israel is a fine place to turn to. As Theodor Herzl said, if you will it, it is no dream. God save the Yazidis, and God bless Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shah, for that important